Welcome to Ian Cinema, your destination for endless entertainment and unforgettable movie moments. Discover exciting films, inspiring stories, and cinematic journeys across every genre. Whether you love action, drama, thrillers, or timeless favorites, there's always something waiting for you here. Sit back, enjoy the experience, and let Ian Cinema bring the magic of movies to your screen. There are evenings when cinema feels less like entertainment and more like a companion, as something you turn to because it reflects your quiet anxieties, your hidden strength, or that gentle reminder that beneath all the noise of the world, there is still a human story waiting to be heard. Today, I want to welcome you into one of those evenings. Hello, my fellow lovers of literature and film. My dear explorers of meaning, to those of you who never settle for surface-level stories, but instead long to peel back the layers until something raw and truthful is revealed. In this space, you and I are not bound by the conventional idea of what a movie review should be. Instead, we're having a conversation, an almost secret exchange where what we truly explore is life, morality, and the symbols that continue to haunt us long after the credits have rolled. And to begin that conversation tonight, I bring you The Beekeeper, 2024. I should make something clear from the beginning. What follows is not a conventional movie review. It is something closer to an intellectual excavation, a critical reflection wrapped in the language of storytelling. I'm not here to rate the fight scenes, compare directors, or debate box office numbers. I'm here to hold the film in my hands, turn it around, and examine how it reflects against my own life and perhaps yours as well. If you've been here before, you already know that my goal is never persuasion, it's connection. And if you're new here, welcome. You have found a community that sees cinema as literature, as philosophy, and as an echo of the human condition. If that resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe, not out of obligation, but out of kinship, because this is more than simply watching movies. It's about discovering the deeper stories and ideas hidden within them. The Beekeeper arrived not simply as an action thriller, but as something closer to a cultural moment. It is one of those films that wears the familiar coat of a genre picture while concealing something richer and almost mythic beneath it. Starring Jason Statham in one of his most primal and stripped-down roles, and directed with relentless grit, the film is packaged as a sleek modern revenge story. Yet beneath the surface, it feels like a parable about justice, corruption, and the fragile line between ordinary people and the machinery of power. On the surface, it is a story about a man whose quiet life caring for bees is violently disrupted, forcing him to awaken a darker, more disciplined side of himself. But beneath that premise lies an allegory that connects to an age-old struggle between the powerless and the predators who thrive in plain sight. I have to admit something. While watching it, I didn't see only Jason Statham fighting his way through hordes of faceless enemies. I saw a meditation on order and chaos. I thought about how, in every society, there are forces that thrive by preying on vulnerability, and how, every so often, a solitary figure appears who dares to restore the balance and reclaim a sense of dignity. That made me realize this wasn't merely cinematic spectacle. It felt almost like a fable. The bees themselves become a metaphor, not only for the protagonist's chosen way of life, but also for community, hierarchy, and the protection of the hive from outside threats. Suddenly, the film seemed to be asking for more than my attention. It wanted to unsettle me. It wanted to whisper something about the price of justice in a world that has grown comfortable with exploitation. The film's introduction is deceptively calm. We meet a man living with precision, care, and solitude. He tends to his bees as though every small movement were a form of prayer. It reminded me of the way great literature often begins with simplicity, how Homer begins with an invocation, or how ancient stories begin in the ordinary lives of their characters before gradually pulling us toward chaos, conflict, and philosophy. This man and his bees, this quiet and controlled existence, are not simply background details. They are a thesis statement, and we already know what stories like this demand. Order must eventually collide with disorder. The disruption doesn't arrive in the form of an earthquake or a war. Instead, it comes through something far more insidious and modern, the ruthless machinery of exploitation disguised beneath the conveniences of the digital age. Here's the part that struck me personally: the villains don't arrive with guns blazing, they arrive through schemes, scams, and calculated manipulation. They are people so cold that they no longer see vulnerable individuals as fellow human beings, but as resources waiting to be drained. That idea resonates because we live in a world where such exploitation is all too familiar. Maybe you've seen the phone calls that target elderly relatives, corporations that reduce people to data points, or bureaucracies that wear down the vulnerable until they have nothing left to give. While watching the film, I found myself thinking about my own encounters with that kind of machinery and the quiet frustration it leaves behind. How many of us, even if only for a moment, dream of someone like this Beekeeper, a person who is disciplined, relentless, and incorruptible, someone willing to step forward when everyone else turns away. The story reveals itself in layers. First comes a loss that drives him forward, shattering the fragile peace he has built. Then comes the revelation that he is no ordinary man, but someone whose past was forged through violence, a past he deliberately buried in pursuit of a quieter and more dignified existence. And then comes the choice to uncover that past and re-arm himself. Not for conquest, not for money, or justice. That is the skeleton of the story, the bones upon which the action, emotion, and spectacle are built. Yet even as the narrative moves toward revenge, it feels connected to something much older and more timeless: the archetype of the lone avenger, stretching from Gilgamesh and Odysseus to the Western gunslinger and the noir detective. The film understands this tradition, and it embraces it completely. And this is where my admiration for it deepens. For all its explosive action and elaborate choreography, the movie never allows us to forget the bees. They remain a constant, silent presence, yet every swarm, every hum, every metaphor buzzing beneath the surface. A hive can thrive only when order is maintained, when threats are removed, and when each member fulfills its role. Isn't that exactly what the Beekeeper himself represents? His violence, paradoxically, is about restoring balance. His purpose is to ensure that the hive survives. His actions are not presented as random destruction, they are surgical, and that precision elevates the entire story. Because suddenly, we are no longer watching merely a revenge thriller, we are watching a philosophy being acted out on screen. This, to me, is what makes films like The Beekeeper so fascinating. They are Trojan horses. They travel on the wheels of adrenaline, action, and spectacle, but inside they carry something heavier: allegory, social criticism, and deeply human questions. As I watched, I didn't feel merely entertained. I felt implicated. Because if the Beekeeper's purpose is to protect the hive, then who is protecting ours? Who is watching over the vulnerable people in our neighborhoods, our communities, and our increasingly fractured system? The movie raises this question without ever stating it directly, and perhaps that is the true essence of art, and not to provide answers, but to unsettle us, to make us look again at a world we thought we understood. So tonight, as we take this deep dive together, I want you to approach it not simply as a review, but as a shared meditation. Yes, we'll follow the narrative, but more importantly, we'll explore the deeper currents beneath it, the themes of justice and corruption, the symbolism of bees and hives, and the tension between solitude and responsibility. We'll ask why these archetypes continue to endure, why audiences still lean forward when a lone figure declares war on corruption, and what it says about us that we find comfort in stories like these. So I invite you not to watch as passive viewers, but as fellow readers of cinema. Let's treat this film like a text, like a story being told around a fire, and listen for the echoes it leaves in our own lives. The Beekeeper isn't simply about one man. It's about the fragile hive we all inhabit and the price of protecting it. As we move deeper into its world, scene by scene, allow its symbols to sting, its silences to hum, and its story to remind you that cinema, much like literature, is always about more than what first appears on the surface. There is something almost meditative about the way the story begins. Its rhythm is quiet and deliberate, as though we're being invited to breathe alongside a man who has found refuge in simplicity. The image of a beekeeper tending to his hives is more than just an opening scene. It's a declaration. Every movement is precise, the lifting of the frames, the careful inspection of the honeycombs, the gentle hum of the bees. It feels less like background noise and more like a chorus of the heartbeat of the film. This small ritual of order and devotion immediately establishes a sense of peace. For me, it brought to mind those passages in novels where an author lingers over ordinary daily tasks. Not because they were exciting, but because they create a sense of grounding. We meet this man not in chaos, but in control, a person who seems to have earned his quiet life. And yet, as viewers, we can feel something lurking beneath its calm. An action thriller rarely begins with peace unless that peace is about to be shattered. The fragility of that tranquility becomes painfully clear when his elderly neighbor, a woman whose warmth feels genuine from the moment we meet her, becomes a victim. At first, her situation seems like a simple intrusion from the outside world, one of those scam calls we've all heard about, promising fake technical support or finding ways to drain someone's bank account. But here, the consequences are devastating. She falls victim to a ruthless digital scam that wipes out her savings and leaves her emotionally destroyed. It made me think about how the modern villain often arrives without bullets or fists. Instead, he comes through algorithms, phishing links, deception, and the manipulation of trust. It is a distinctly 21st century form of cruelty, faceless, invisible, yet capable of causing enormous damage. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but think about the moments when people close to us have nearly fallen into similar traps. And there is a particular kind of anger that emerges when you realize someone is deliberately profiting from another person's vulnerability. When she ultimately takes her own life after losing her sense of dignity and security, the story crosses a crucial threshold. This is no longer simply the story of a man and his bees. It becomes a story about grief transforming into purpose. For him, the tragedy is unbearable not only because of the loss, but because what happened was unjust, preventable, and deliberately cruel. This is where the stillness finally cracks, and fragments of his hidden past begin to emerge. We don't yet know the full truth about who he is, but we begin to sense that he is no ordinary recluse or simple beekeeper. His stillness was never the result of inexperience, it was restraint. And now that restraint has been burned away, the first half of the film develops with deliberate pacing. He begins tracing the scam back to its source, and the trail leads not to some anonymous overseas server, but to a deeply entrenched network operating with remarkable impunity. One of the film's more effective choices is that it doesn't portray these criminals merely as shadowy figures hiding in dark rooms. They are protected, almost institutionalized, feeding on vulnerable people while operating beneath the shield of powerful individuals. We see call centers buzzing with exploitation, filled with operators who speak with mechanical detachment as they drain the financial lifeblood of ordinary people. The contrast is chilling. The beekeeper's quiet rituals of care placed against the cold, calculated efficiency of predation. As he follows the trail, pieces of his identity gradually surface. The solitary man who initially appears almost fragile reveals a deep understanding of violence, an awareness of complex systems, and a discipline that clearly comes from a life lived long before he ever tended a hive. Even the name Beekeeper begins to acquire a second meaning. It no longer refers only to the literal profession, it becomes the name of an operative, a guardian connected to a shadowy past. The mythology surrounding him begins to grow. He isn't simply an angry man seeking revenge, he is part of something larger, a clandestine order, a system that once turned people like him into weapons, but now, he has chosen to walk away from that life. The problem is that retreat has been denied to him. I found this especially compelling because it echoes a literary archetype I've always admired: the reluctant hero, the person who has laid down the sword only to discover that circumstances are forcing it back into his hands. Think of Odysseus being pulled away from home and back into war. Think of the Ronin in Japanese tales, summoned once again toward vengeance. The Beekeeper belongs to that same lineage. The difference is that his enemy isn't a single warlord or king. It is the entire architecture of corruption. His first missions are relatively small in scale. Almost like reconnaissance, he targets local nodes within the scam operation and dismantles them with remarkable precision. These sequences aren't simply action showcases, they feel more like carefully choreographed demonstrations of control. Every strike, every movement, and every decision is calculated. I also appreciate how the filmmakers resist indulging in unnecessary excess. The violence isn't presented as something glamorous. Instead, it is stripped down and transformed into a form of necessity. And with every confrontation, the hive metaphor becomes stronger. He is effectively purging an infection from the comb, removing the rot before it has a chance to spread. But eventually, his actions attract attention. The scam operation is not an isolated criminal enterprise. It reaches upward, connecting to higher levels of power and wealth, including influential figures with political connections. Here lies one of the film's deeper critiques. Corruption doesn't survive only in the shadows. It thrives in the mainstream, nourished by the very institutions designed to protect ordinary citizens. The Beekeeper becomes a threat not only to criminals, but also to the architects of a predatory system. As a result, opposition begins to gather against him. One sequence from the first half particularly stayed with me: the confrontation inside a buzzing office filled with cubicles, where dozens of scammers operate like worker bees turned upside down, feeding not the hive, but draining it. He moves through the office like a shadow, terrifying yet strangely righteous, dismantling the operation with ruthless efficiency. It made me think about how allegory can sometimes hide in plain sight. Here was a hive corrupted and twisted into something that no longer existed for survival or community, but for exploitation. He wasn't simply destroying a hive. He was restoring balance by eliminating the false one. The first half builds toward a powerful crescendo as his actions become increasingly aggressive. We learn more about the Beekeepers as an organization and the secret program that trained him and the philosophy behind it. Their methods are rooted in ruthless efficiency, but that efficiency is tempered by a larger sense of purpose. He isn't simply an avenger, he is the product of an ideology that has made him uniquely capable of standing against these criminal networks. The combination of myth and realism is compelling. On the surface, it is an action thriller. Beneath that surface, it feels almost biblical, a lone righteous figure cleansing the temple of corruption. What makes this section so compelling, at least for me, is how personal it remains. Even as the scale expands to include powerful figures, corporations, and politics, the emotional core never disappears. At its heart, this is a man seeking justice for the dignity of a neighbor or an ordinary woman destroyed by extraordinary cruelty. It reminds us that behind every statistic and every headline about scams or fraud, there is a human face. Sometimes that person is far too vulnerable to survive the consequences of such a loss. The Beekeeper's war is therefore not abstract. It is heartbreak transformed into action. By the time the first half ends, we have moved from the quiet solitude of the hives to a storm gathering across powerful institutions. The Beekeeper has revealed himself not only to his enemies, but also to us, a man of terrifying discipline, driven not by greed but by grief, not by chaos but by ardor. The hive he protects is ultimately humanity itself, while the infection he fights is something we recognize from our own lives and societies. The stage is now set for a much larger confrontation with the machinery of power. The storm that had been gathering in the first half breaks open in the second. By this point, his presence can no longer be dismissed as an isolated disturbance. The damage he has inflicted on the fraudulent networks is too precise and too disruptive, leaving the powerful men behind the operation deeply unsettled. At first, they assume they are dealing with another vigilante, perhaps a former soldier, someone angry enough to throw his life away. But as whispers about his true identity begin to spread, fear slowly takes hold. He isn't simply one man. He is a legend brought back to life, a ghost from a secret order known as the Beekeepers, whose members were trained to remain invisible while becoming nearly impossible to stop. That realization sends ripples of panic through the corridors of power, and in their desperation, the stakes rise dramatically. What fascinates me here is how the movie expands its scope without losing its intimacy. The scam no longer feels like a small collection of criminals. It becomes a monstrous machine reaching deep into political circles. We see senators, lobbyists, and wealthy men in expensive suits speaking with the calm confidence of people who believe themselves untouchable. Then that confidence begins to crack. Suddenly, they are confronted with the possibility that someone is willing to tear their fortress apart, brick by brick. And at the center of it all stands a man moving with singular purpose, guided by grief but sharpened by discipline. This is where the film's sense of myth becomes especially strong. It is the image of a lone hero storming the citadel, not with an army behind him, but with conviction burning inside him. The confrontations in the second half become bigger and more theatrical, yet they never completely lose their connection to reality. There is a sequence in which he traces the fraud network to an extravagant mansion, a palace of excess built on the suffering of ordinary people. He moves through its halls not as a guest, but as an executioner, dismantling security, taking down guards, and exposing the decadence for what it truly is, a hive that has become cancerous. The imagery struck me deeply. Chandeliers glitter above men who have built their wealth from other people's misery, while the beekeeper moves through their world like justice given human form. When the violence erupts, it doesn't feel like meaningless chaos. It feels like cleansing. Every movement is stripped of excess and reduced to raw necessity. As the film approaches its midpoint climax, one of its most powerful themes begins to emerge: the tension between who the beekeeper was trained to become and who he is now choosing to be. He is no longer following orders. No government or secret agency is dictating his actions. His morality belongs entirely to him. That raises questions that linger long after the scenes have ended. When justice fails within established systems, and vulnerable people are abandoned, what responsibility falls upon the individual? Is stepping into that void an act of righteousness, or an act of arrogance? The film never gives us a simple answer. Instead, it leaves the question hanging in the air, buzzing like the hum of bees in the background. Eventually, the opposition becomes so powerful that even the government gets involved, not to help him, but to stop him. A man operating outside the system, even when his intentions appear righteous, becomes a threat to the system itself. Federal agents begin closing in, police barricades rise. Strategies are designed to trap him, yet every attempt fails because he doesn't survive through luck, he survives through precision. He has spent his entire life mastering invisibility, efficiency, and survival. Watching him evade one opponent after another felt almost like watching a chess master play against an entire room of opponents at once. Every move is calculated, every counter is anticipated and neutralized before it can land. The true escalation arrives when the puppet masters finally begin to reveal themselves. The faceless scam is not simply about call centers or offshore accounts. It is connected to someone with enormous political influence. The son of a powerful politician, entitled and ruthless, emerges as one of the central figures behind the operation. Protected by wealth, privilege, and family legacy. He genuinely believes himself untouchable. Watching him sneer while surrounded by men whose purpose is to protect him brought up a familiar kind of anger, the frustration we all recognize when institutions bend over backward to shield the powerful while the vulnerable are left to collapse. It is at this point that the Beekeeper's mission takes on an almost biblical quality. He is no longer merely dismantling a fraud operation. He is tearing down the idols of corruption. The battles intensify. Warehouses burn, networks collapse, and every step brings him closer to the heart of the rot. The second half doesn't shy away from spectacle, gunfights, close quarters combat, explosions, and increasingly elaborate action sequences. But beneath all that spectacle is a steady metaphor. Every action reflects the philosophy of the hive. Order must be restored, and the infection must be removed. I found myself becoming less interested in the choreography of punches and bullets and more interested in what each fight represented. One man stands against the illusion of power, exposing just how fragile that power can actually be. There is a late film sequence in which he confronts a swarm of bodyguards protecting one of the operation's key figures. The situation should be impossible. The odds are overwhelming, and the walls seem insurmountable, yet he moves through them like a starman, not with reckless rage, but with precise, almost surgical calm. It reminded me of Milton's famous idea that even those who simply stand and wait can serve a purpose. Here, the idea is inverted. The Beekeeper serves by moving, by refusing to wait, by acting when everyone else has remained silent. It also reminded me of the responsibility literature so often places upon its heroes. Not necessarily to win easily, but to endure when the odds seem impossible, because endurance itself can become a form of truth. As the climax approaches, all the threads finally begin to converge. The politician whose son helped orchestrate the scams can no longer hide behind his position, and the Beekeeper forces him toward a confrontation that can no longer be avoided. This is not merely a clash of fists or ideologies, it is a confrontation between a man who has built his life around order and sacrifice and another who has prospered through exploitation and entitlement. Their conflict is deeply personal, but it is also societal. The camera lingers on their words, their stares, and their silences. In that tension, the entire film seems to crystallize. This is no longer just a story about bees or scams. It becomes a question of what kind of hive we are willing to live in. Do we accept a world ruled by predators, or do we demand one protected by guardians? The resolution is fierce and inevitable. The sun sets. The networks collapse. The illusion of invincibility finally breaks. Yet the film does not end in simple triumph. Instead, it returns to silence. The Beekeeper goes back to his hives, and the familiar hum rises once again, echoing the opening of the film. What has happened cannot undo the tragedy that set him on this path. His neighbor is still gone. The wound is still fresh, but for the moment, order has been restored. The hive begins to thrive again. It is bittersweet, and that is exactly why the ending stays with you. As the credits rolled, I found myself thinking about the cyclical nature of the story. He began in solitude, was pulled into violence, and eventually returned to solitude, but he was no longer the same man. The bee seemed to hum differently now, not like a lullaby, but like a reminder. For me, that felt like the perfect allegory for our own struggles. We, too, tend to our small lives and fragile routines until injustice forces us to wake up, and even when we eventually return to our ordinary lives, we are never quite the same. Once we demand justice, the experience changes us. That is why the second half of the film feels like more than a conclusion. It becomes a meditation. It explores the cost of vigilance, the necessity of guardianship, and the inevitability of corruption when we refuse to confront it. In that sense, the Beekeeper is more than a single man. He represents an idea that within every hive, there must be someone willing to protect the vulnerable, even if doing so costs them their peace. What stayed with me after the story ended was not simply the image of fists colliding or buildings burning, it was the faces and silences of the characters who carried the weight of the story. A film like this, presented as an action thriller, could easily reduce its characters to familiar archetypes: the stoic avenger, the helpless victim, and the faceless villains. Yet what sets it apart, at least in my experience, is the sense that each character feels alive. They are not simply serving a role in the plot, they reflect different aspects of the world we live in. They rarely speak in grand philosophical terms. Instead, they express their philosophies through their choices, through what they protect, what they sacrifice, and what they are willing to destroy. And when we look closely at them, we begin to uncover the heart of the film's meaning. At the center is Adam Clay, the beekeeper himself, played with a tightly controlled precision Jason Statham has mastered over the years. What fascinates me most about Clay is not his violence, even though the film makes it feel almost inevitable. It is his restraint. His introduction gives us the clearest picture of who he truly is, a man quietly tending to bees. I think that is the most authentic version of Clay. He is someone who longs for order, simplicity, and community. Violence does not define him. In his world, it represents disruption. He does not smile at it. He does not enjoy it. And he certainly does not wear it as a badge of honor. Only when injustice tears apart the fragile hive he has created does he summon the part of himself he believed he had buried. That makes him feel less like a killer and more like a monk to me. His silence is almost monastic, his movements are disciplined, and even his violence feels ritualistic, closer to duty than desire. In him, I saw echoes of figures like Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general who returned to his plough after defending the Republic. It is the archetype of reluctant guardianship, a theme that has always resonated with me because it suggests that true strength is not found in the desire for power, but in having the ability to walk away from it. Then there is Eloise, the neighbor whose tragedy sets the entire story in motion. She may not occupy much screen time, but her presence seems to haunt every scene that follows. She is not written as a stereotypical elderly woman. Instead, she is portrayed as someone filled with quiet warmth, the kind of neighbor whose simple kindness carries a sense of humanity. That is why her downfall is so devastating. It is not simply the loss of her life that hurts. It is the realization that the world offered her no protection. She becomes both a character and a symbol, a reminder that corruption does not prey only on the powerful. It targets the trusting, the vulnerable, and those who believe they are safe. In literature, characters like her often remind us what is truly worth protecting. Eloise becomes the face of innocence crushed by a machine far larger than herself, and in her absence, she becomes the soul of the film. I kept thinking, we do not rage simply because she is gone, we rage because she should never have been left unprotected in the first place. Standing opposite Clay is an entire collection of villains, and I use that word carefully, because the film does not portray them as cartoonish figures. At the ground level, the scammers are chilling precisely because they feel so ordinary. Inside their buzzing offices, they become something like worker bees turned upside down. Every call drains something from an elderly person, a lonely individual, or someone simply desperate enough to trust the wrong voice. They are interchangeable, and that is exactly what makes them frightening. There is no single villain at the center of it all. There is a system, a faceless swarm. They represent the way modern cruelty can disguise itself as business. Exploitation hides behind headsets, scripts, office desks, and corporate language. I find it difficult to hate them as individuals because, in many ways, they have stopped being individuals. They are cogs inside a machine, and I think that is precisely the point. They remind us that evil does not always look like a traditional villain twirling a mustache. Sometimes, it looks like ordinary people following orders in exchange for a paycheck. Then, at the top of that system, we meet Derek Danforth, the entitled son of a powerful politician whose arrogance and cruelty become the human face of the corruption. He is the spoiled heir we have encountered countless times in both literature and real life. He a man who believes himself untouchable because the system has never forced him to experience consequences. There is almost a mythic necessity to his character. Stories like this need a face, someone onto whom we can project our outrage, even when we understand that the deeper problem is structural. Danforth represents privilege transformed into predation, watching him sneer behind layers of wealth and influence. I felt the same frustration that often arises when we read about real-world scandals, so when corruption makes the headlines, but accountability never seems to follow. He is not unique, and that is exactly what makes him unforgettable. Alongside him stands his mother, a congresswoman whose political influence protects the entire operation. She represents another form of corruption, hypocrisy. She is a public servant who, behind closed doors, serves only her own family and dynasty. What fascinated me about her portrayal was not simply her corruption. We expect that from the character. It was her composure. She is calm, rehearsed, and almost serene in the way she manipulates people. Unlike her son, she does not openly display her arrogance. Instead, she hides behind the language of responsibility, policy, and public duty. That contrast makes her even more dangerous. Her son is reckless enough to attract attention. She is careful enough to survive. That dynamic between them feels like an echo of the world we already know. Young, entitled heirs who behave recklessly because they have rarely been denied anything, and experienced guardians of power who quietly maintain systems of exploitation without ever needing to raise their voices. Another character who fascinated me is Verona Parker, the FBI agent drawn into the Beekeeper's orbit. At first, she represents the system and the law attempting to stop Clay. She pursues him not because she is malicious, but because she believes in her duty and cannot accept what he is doing as something the law can simply tolerate. But as she begins to uncover the corruption Clay is exposing, her internal conflict grows. In many ways, she becomes our entry point into the story. She is the character who wrestles with the gray areas of justice and gradually realizes that legality and morality do not always point in the same direction. For me, her arc is about awakening. It is about learning to see beyond what is written in the law and recognizing what is true in the human conscience. I appreciated her not because she single-handedly saves the day she does not, but because she represents the struggle between conscience and duty that defines so many lives. And beneath it all, there is that persistent human, the quiet, almost invisible presence of the hive, always reminding us what the story is really about. They're the bees themselves. They are not characters in a literal sense, Buddha in a symbolic sense. They are omnipresent. Every time Clay returns to them, every time their buzzing fills the soundtrack. They remind us of what Thieves is really about, the hive, the vulnerable, the delicate balance of order. They are more than insects. They are moral witnesses. In them, I saw the chorus of a Greek tragedy. Not speaking in words but in sound, reminding us of fast stakes, lamenting the losses, singing the necessity of justice. In the interplay of these characters, the film becomes more than action. Clay is not simply a man avenging a neighbor, he is an embodiment of reluctant duty. Eloise is not merely a victim, she is a spirit of what must be defended. Danforth and his mother are not just villains, they are the manifestation of systemic corruption. Verona is not just an agent, she is the conscience torn between the wind truth and the bees. The bees are the hymn that ties it all together. What I love most, though, is how Thessie characters refuse to let the story become simple. Clay is not a hero in the Hollywood sense. His violence leaves as his scars. His mission is as much burden as a purpose. Eloise's death is not undone, her absence not filled by justice. The villains do not stand alone, but also symptoms of deeper disease. Even Verona, for all her awakening, is left in the tension of a broken system. The complexity is what makes them literary, What makes the film feel like a text worth analyzing rather than just a watching? Each character reflects a facet of ourselves, of our society, of our fears and hopes, and when the credits roll, we don't leave with a single hero to cheer, but with a hive of questions buzzing inside us. What I find most enchanting when I step away from the screen and look behind it is how many strange and almost mythic details surround the making of The Beekeeper. The movie wears itself as a lean action thriller on the surface. But peel back at production history, its inspirations and the atmosphere on set, and you begin to see a tapestry of oddities and of fascinating accidents that feel as if they belong to the story itself. You make the film less a manufactured product and more a living thing. A hive of its own with workers, rituals, mishaps, and legends buzzing inside it. One of the strangest things I discovered is that Jason Statham, before agreeing to play Adam Clay, actually spent time with real beekeepers in England. He wanted to understand the rituals, the patience, the calm discipline required to handle bees. And apparently on his very first day visiting a hive, he was stung not once, but several times in succession. Most actors would laugh it off as part research, but Statham took it as a kind of initiation. He even joked in an interview that the bees were retesting whether he was worthy to play a man who lived among them. I loved that image. The stoic action star who has fought cinematic armies and left office skyscrapers humbled by creatures that weigh less than a gram. It's poetic in a way because it reflects Clay's own arc in the story. Power humbled. Violence tempered by smallness. Strength rediscovered only after first being a stung. The choice of David Ayer as a director carries its own peculiar weight. Known for End of Watch and Fury, Ayer has always gravitated towards stories of men caught between morality and violence. Yet, when he first read the script for The Beekeeper, he reportedly thought it was too strange to pass up. An action film centered in bees. A secret society of vigilantes calling themselves beekeepers. It sounded to him like pulp, but what hooked him was a metaphor, the same only that hooked audiences later. The hive of a society, the beekeeper as guardian. Ayer has spoken about how during shooting, he would often remind cast and crew, remember, we're not just shooting an action scene, we're showing order fighting chaos. That mantra apparently became a kind of inside joke. Whisper were never said to send it into the chaos of explosions or logistical mayhem. Another curious fact. The production faced unexpected interruptions due to real bees. Some scenes were shot near live hives brought on set for authenticity, and despite professional handlers, swarms would occasionally disrupt filming. Crew members would suddenly scatter, cameras left rolling as tiny invaders filled the air. Only an assistant recalled that the sound crew had nightmares because the bees' hum was picked up in the boom mix, sometimes making it nearly impossible to separate from the score. In post-production, the sound designers leaned into it, incorporating real high recordings into the film's background ambience. So, when you hear that low hum in the movie, it isn't just sound design, it's a genuine vibration of bees captured in uncontrolled moments. That detail for me transforms a film. It means the bees are not just symbols, they are participants in the story. And then there are the smaller, odder details that only surface when you look closely. The protagonist of Farmhouse, for example, wasn't set on a real property in Massachusetts. It had once belonged to a family of amatripists. When the crew arrived, they discovered remnants of old hives still scattered across the land, weathered and abandoned. Ayer decided not to remove them, insisting they stay in the background of shots as subtle evidence of history. It makes me wonder how many viewers noticed, how many realize that in some frames, the wooden boxes we see aren't props, but the relics of real bees who once lived there. It gives the film an almost archaeological texture. Fiction layered over truth. One of my favorite bits of trivia involves the villain's call center set design to look like a modern scam operation. Aate was built inside an abandoned Phylicia building in London. The art department filled with hundreds of fake cubicles, computers running phony programs designed to look like malware scams. But here's the twist: during a filming, one of the prop computers accidentally connected to a relay network, and for a brief moment, the fake scam interface began interacting with real web traffic. IT specialists had to be called in to sever the connection. The crew laughed about it later, saying the set almost became a real scam hub again. It's eerie, the fiction of predation nearly bleeding into reality. Jason Statham himself brought his own odd rituals to the set. Known for doing many of his stunts, he insisted on performing a sequence involving fire without a double. The pyrotechnics team designed the scene carefully, but during one take, the fire spread unpredictably, forcing Statham to improvise his escape. That exact take ended up in the final cut. And if you watch closely, you can see a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes. It's subtle, but adds a layer of authenticity you can't choreograph. To me, that speaks of cinema's strange alchemy. How accents often make the art richer than intention ever could. There's also the curious matter of the screenplay's origins. Co-written by Sylvester Stallone, the script reportedly began as a loose adaptation of a revenge novel unrelated to bees. It was Stallone who suggested weaving in napalm imagery inspired by his own childhood fascination with the honeybees. At first, producers resisted, fearing audiences would find it ridiculous. But Stallone argued that without metaphor, the story would just be another revenge thriller lost in the crowd. His instincts proved correct. The very strange use of the bee motif is what set the film apart. What made critics and audiences talk. Isn't that strange? That what seemed too odd became the story's heart. Even the film's score carries unusual history. Composer David Ayer wove actual recordings of bees into his compositions, slowing and layering them until they sounded like mouse drones beneath strings and percussion. At times, what we think is a synthesizer is actually the pitch-shifted hum of thousands of wings. The music then is not just accompaniment but atmosphere. Nature's own instruments reimagined as a heartbeat of vengeance. It makes me think of how art at its most alive blurs the boundaries between the real and the crafted, between accident and intention. Of course, no film is free from the share of accidents that later read like omens. During one night shoot, a thunderstorm hit the set unexpectedly, forcing the crew to shelter under tents. Stu reportedly stayed outside, watching the storm, bees still buzzing faintly in their hives nearby. A crew member swears he heard a mutter. Nature keeps the balance better than we do, whether apocryphal or not. That anecdote has flowed around interviews as if it were part of the myth-making surrounding the film. It feels almost scripted, which may be the best truth too. What I carry away from all these strange facts is a sense that The Beekeeper was never just a film stitched together by scheduleless budgets. It was a hive in itself, unpredictable, buzzing, full of mishaps that somehow enriched the story. From real bees disrupting soundtracks to actors stung into humility. From abandoned hives appearing on screen to fictional scams nearly becoming real. The film's production mirrored its own themes: chaos intruding on order, a vulnerability demanding vigilance. It is as if the universe itself conspired to remind the filmmakers what their story was about. And isn't that in its own way the most fitting tribute that a story about hives and guardians, predators and protectors would find itself shaped by real swarms, real stings, real actions that demand an adaptation? It makes the movie less a closed work of fiction and a more living text buzz with the energy of its making. To me, that is the strangest and most beautiful fact of all. That art like a hive is alive only because of the unpredictable movements of the workers and the accidents that force it into resilience. There are certain moments in a film that refuse to remain only scenes. They linger, demand a reflection, and seem to echo far beyond their runtime. In The Beekeeper, the major events unfold with the precision of an action thriller. Yet, when I see them with them, they feel less like kiya entertainment and more like parablessed disguised in adrenaline. It's worth pausing here with you to look at these turning points critically. Not to summarize them, but to weigh them as symbols, as cultural mirrors, as emotional mirrors. The first event that still trembles inside me is Eloisa's downfall. The elderly neighbor, gently and kind, who becomes prey to a scum that strips her of everything at face value. It is a plot device, the inciting incident that sets Adam Clay on his path, but from a critical lens, it is so much more. Her devastation is not just about money. It is about the shattering of dignity, the destruction of safety in a world already fragile. Watching her succumb to despair, I thought how modern a villain rarely arrives in the form of visible monsters anymore. Instead, aate creeps in through phone calls, emails, scams that know exactly how to exploit loneliness and trust. Eloise is not just a character. She is our mothers, our grandparents, anyone who has ever been told by society that they are safe only to be abandoned when the wolves arrive. Her death forces a question in a civilization obsessed with innovation and profit who guards the vulnerable. The question is the hive's first fracture. The second event that demands analysis is Clay's decision to act. Stories like kiya this often present violence as an eruption of rage. But here at Ice is something else. A deliberate choice to honor a part of himself he had locked away. He could have mourned silently, tended his bees, and allowed the machinery of corruption to keep turning. Instead, he takes upon himself the role of the avenger, though it's important to see it less as revenge and more as a reclamation of balance. Critically, this is where the film steps into allegory. He does not act simply because he is angry. He acts because order has been broken. In his hands, violence becomes a ritual like pruning diseased branches to save a tree. We must ask, is this justice or is it vigilantism versus morality? The ambiguity is deliberate and that is what makes it powerful. A third critical event lies in the exposure to call center. The hive inverted. Here the symbolism is almost too precise to ignore. A room buzzing with voices, workers laboring not for survival of community but for its exploitation. Drones not protecting the hive but hollowing it from within. When Clay storms that space, dismantling aate with terrifying calm. We are not just watching an action set piece. We are witnessing the allegorical destruction of a false hive. It is a chilling critique of how our world has replaced a genuine community with systems that mimic it only to exploit it. Corporations that use the language of family. Governments that use the language of service. Scams that choose the language of help. What makes this scene critical is not the fist flying, but the philosophy buzzing beneath. Not all hives are worth protecting. Some must be destroyed so that the real ones can survive. The escalation to the political realm is another turning point that deserves scrutiny. When the story reveals that the fraud is not isolated but tethered to power, when we see the entitled Ayer and his mother, the congresswoman, this is where the film stops being personal and becomes structural. It critiques the unholy marriage between crime and politics, between exploitation and illegitimacy. The son, brash and reckless, is an easy target for our anger, but the mother is subtler. She cloaks here corruption and rhetoric in the performance of responsibility. From a critical standpoint, she is perhaps the more dangerous of the two because she represents the way systems perpetuate themselves not through chaos but through order maintained in service of rot. She is the perfect inversion of Clay. He uses order to protect the hive, she uses order to drain it. Their eventual collision is not simply character versus a character, it is philosophy versus a philosophy. A climactic confrontations carry another layer of meaning. Critics might view them as formulaic action. Beneath the spectacle lies a meditation on inevitability. Clay's advance is not fueled by invincibility, but by inevitability. Like a natural force in a correcting imbalance, each fight scene of the slight becomes less about a choreography and more about metaphor. When he dismantles security teams, storming fortresses of wealth, what we are seeing is not just man against man, but the fragile illusion of power collapsing against reality of conviction. Guns, guards, and influence falter not because they are weak in themselves, but because they were hollow when measured against something rooted in purpose. The confrontation with Derek Danforth, the son, is another event that resonates critically. He embodies entitlement, a man who has never been told no, who has built his life on the presumption of impunity. His downfall is not merely his defeat, it is his exposure. For him, the true punishment is not death, but the shattering of the illusion that he is untouchable. In mythic terms, he is Icarus, flying on the wings of wealth and power, only to be brought down by his own arrogance. The Beekeeper does not merely kill him, he punctures the illusion he represents. Perhaps the most profound moment, however, lies not in combat, but in a return after the storm of violence. Clay returns to his bees, the hum of the hive resuming as if nothing has happened. This bookend is easy to miss a symbolic repetition, but critically, it resonates like a cycle. The man has restored order, but at what cost? The hive is safer now, but the loss that propelled him cannot be undone. The world is not redeemed, only temporarily balanced. To me, this is a film's most honest admission. Justice is never final. Ida must be enacted again and again by whoever has the strength to rise. The quiet hum at the end is not peace, but a reminder. Thematically, these events together form a critique of modern society's failures. Eloise's death exposes the vulnerability of the weak. The Scam Center critiques the false hives that exploit. The political corruption highlights the system's complicity. The climax critiques the illusion of vulnerability among the privileged. And finally, Clay's return to hive reminds us that the cycle of injustice and guardianship never truly ends. From a critical perspective, this is not just an action thriller. It is a fable for an age where institutions fail and individuals must bear the burden of justice. What I love is how the film refuses to give us comfort. Yes, villains fall. Yes, the scam collapses, but the wound remains. Eloise does not return. Corruption is not destroyed everywhere. Clay himself remains in a solitude. The story whispers a truth the literature has always known. Justice is never perfect, and the hive is never permanently safe. The role of the Beekeeper is eternal as the vulnerability of the hive itself. In the end, what makes these events so significant is not their surface drama, but the questions they pose. What protects the weak when systems fail? What is the difference between justice and vengeance? When does order become tyranny? And when does violence become salvation? These are not questions the film answers. Instead, it leaves theme buzzing like the humbees in the background, demanding that we carry theme with us into our own world. There's always a secret film hidden inside the one we watch on screen, the film that happened behind the camera in long nights, strange accidents, small triumphs, and endless experiments. The Beekeeper is no exception. In fact, I think the oddities and struggles of Ida production mirror the movie's own themes: order wrestling with chaos, patience tested, balance restored only through persistence. To talk about these films making is to step into another hive, buzzing with workers, each within their role, sometimes stung, sometimes sweetened, but always laboring towards something bigger than themselves. The decision to pair Jason Statham with a David Ayer was already unusual. Ayer, known for fury and watch, had carved a reputation for gritty, grounded stories, while Statham was Hollywood's action machine known for precision in choreography. The marriage of their approaches created tension at first. Ayer's instinct was always to dig for realism, to let messiness and unpredictability bleed into the frame. Statham, by contrast, was almost obsessive about timing, about economy of motion. Crew members spoke of days where they would debate whether a fight should look brutal and raw, would miss punches and stumbles, or whether it should appear clean and calculated, like a ritual of violence. In the end, both instincts merged. The fights in the Beekeeper feel surgical yet weighty, like a man who has trained for order, but is battling chaos itself. It's fascinating that this synthesis wasn't designed from the start, but discovered through clashes on set. One of the more charming production insights involves the bees themselves. To capture authenticity, the filmmakers decided early on that they would use real bees in certain scenes. Supervised by professional-abists, what they didn't anticipate was how much those bees would dictate the rhythm of the set. During a one-sequence shot on the farmhouse property, a handler misjudged the temperature conditions and the hive became restless. Dozens of bees swarmed the lights and cameras, forcing the entire crew to evacuate whilst calmly stay behind, watching the chaos with a smirk. "This is their set, not ours," he reportedly said. It became a motto among the crew members. Whenever production hit a snag, someone would mutter, "It's their set, not ours." A gentle reminder that sometimes a film must adapt to forces beyond control. Sound design, too, also its fun little legends. The audio team wanted the hum of bees to bleed into the soundtrack, not as literal sound, but also texture. To achieve this, they recorded thousands of bees in motion and then digitally manipulated the audio, lowering the pitch until it resembled a deep drone. In some moments, what we hear as a sinister musical undercurrent is in fact a slowed hum of insects. This discovery was partly accidental. A sound engineer experimenting late at night stretched a recording far beyond its natural length and realized it sounded like an ominous organ note. That mistake became a key part of the film soundscape. Isn't it curious how the accidents often define the soul of a film more than planned elements? The call center sequences carry their own behind-the-scenes lore. Filmed in an abandoned London office building, the set was so meticulously dressed with the fake computers and scam scripts that at one point local authorities mistook it for an actual fraudulent operation. A minor investigation was launched before producers clarified it was a movie set. Crew members laughed about the irony. A fake scam so convincing it almost goaded them in trouble with the law. It was yet another reminder that fiction and reality were dancing dangerously close throughout this production. Jason Statham's commitment to stunts is already legendary, but here he took things further than most directors would dare allow. In a sequence involving a fire, he refused to use a double, insisting that authenticity mattered more than safety padding. When flames spread unpredictably during one take, Ayer nearly called cut, but still pushed through, improvising his escape. That raw footage tinged with genuine danger became part of the final cut. Later, stunt coordinators admitted that moments shave years off their lives and stress. But isn't it strange how actors sometimes blur the line between the performance and reality so much that you can no longer tell whether you're watching craft or survival? Another fun fact lies in the screenplay's origin. Few people know that Sylvester Stallone had a hand in shaping it. He contributed story ideas, one of which was to be motif itself. Stallone, fascinated since childhood by hives and their symbolism, pushed for weaving pyrosymetry into what would otherwise have been a straightforward revenge thriller. Producers resisted at first. Stallone argued that without metaphor, The story would drown among dozens of similar genre pieces, is gambled off today. It's the bees that make the movie unforgettable. The very element once deemed too odd to take seriously, on set, Statham earned a reputation for monastic discipline. He kept himself in between takes, often returned to the hives just to observe the bees. Crew members described him as almost meditative, sometimes whispering lines of dialogue while watching the insects move. Some joked that he had become half a beekeeper himself. This energy bled into a performance. Clay's silence, his stillness, his almost ritualistic gestures were violence. They were rehearsed not just on the training mats but in the presence of real bees. I love it that thought that the bees in their small quiet ways coached Jason Statham as much as Ayer did. Not all production details were romantic. The film faced logistical nightmares during night shoots. One sequence involving a large explosion in an industrial park triggered noise complaints from nearby neighborhoods. Local residents unaware what was being filmed called authorities believing a terrorist attack was underway. Police arrived mid-shoot and the crew had to pause until permits and explanations were sorted out. Ironically, that particular scene would later be praised for its realism. Real fear had birthed cinematic fear. Editing brought its own quirks. Fred Raskin, the editor, noted that the film's pacing was constantly at war with itself. Ayer wanted space, silence, a moment of reflection. Statham however demanded that never slowed too much. Balancing those instincts required recutting scenes dozens of times. At only a point, the film ran over 3 hours in a rough cut form. Entire subplots were retrimmed, including a more extensive backstory about Clay's time in the secret Beekeeper program. Some fans might mourn the loss of those details, but in truth, the cuts preserve the film's tautness. Still, somewhere out there, perhaps in a vault, exists a longer, stranger version of the Beekeeper. Buzzing with lore that only a few eyes have seen. And then, there are the humanic works that never make it into press kits. Crew members tell stories of David Ayer, starting every shoot day with a strange ritual. He would gather crew, reline from poetry. Sometimes Milton, sometimes Blake, and then send them to a work. His reasoning: we're not making a noise, we're making myth. Most of the crew rolled their eyes, but those moments stuck. I can't help but feel they infuse a film with an energy you can sense but not name. An energy that whispers, this is not just spectacle. This is allegory. When I gather all of these stories together, the best stinging their lead actor, fire go out of control. Scam sets mistaken for real. Poetry recited at dawn. I realized that The Beekeeper was never destined to be a straightforward action movie. It was a hive in itself, full of unpredictable movements, chaos reignited in only by discipline and sweetness born only after stings. That to me is a true fun of its production. The making of the film mirrored the film itself. A story about order against chaos was created by Ayer wrestling with chaos. And maybe that's why the film hums with authenticity, even when it dances into exaggeration, because at every stage, Ayer was shaped not just by craft, but by a mishap, not just by design, but by a chance. The bees were real, the stings were real, the panic was real, the poetry was real. Out of that chaos came something oddly disciplined, almost inevitable, like honey drawn from a hive, messy in the making, but golden in the result. What lingers with me most vividly about The Beekeeper is not just a violence or vengeance, but the spaces where these unfold, the rooms, the landscapes, the textures of light and shadow that give flesh to the starry skeleton. Setting in this film is never neutral. Each location seems to carry a moral weight, as though the walls themselves know whether they're protecting life or enabling corruption. Watching it, I felt as if the environments were characters in their own right, speaking in silence, telling their own truth. It all begins with a farmhouse, A solitary dwelling is surrounded by hives, fields, and a silence. This is not just a home, it is a sanctuary. The wide frames linger and off sunlight filtering through dust motes and hobbies moving in their order, chaos and all Statham's clay moving slowly deliberately among them. The colors here are warm but muted honey yellows, earthy browns and the soft hum of rural life. I thought of how literature often opens with idyls before plunging into a tragedy. How Eden is always described before exile. This farmhouse is Clay's Eden, its fragile paradise, and like yet every Eden, it is doomed to be broken. The serenity of the setting makes the later violence feel all the more jarring, as if corruption has not only taken a life, but invaded a sacred geography. Contrast this with a call center where the farmhouse is organic. The call center is synthetic, rows of fat cubicles under cold fluorescent light, computer screens glowing like artificial suns, voices droning in scripts. They're redesigned to deceive. The cinematography here is deliberate. The camera often frames these spaces in sharp symmetrical lines as though to emphasize or inhuman efficiency. It looks like a hive inverted, buzzing not with community but with exploitation. Watching it, I felt the claustrophobia of modern predation, the way real human beings are transformed into instruments of theft. It struck me that the contrast between the two settings, the farmhouse and the call center, is the entire moral battle of the film embodied in space. One is a natural order, one is manufactured chaos. Then there are the lavish mansions, the decadent palaces with the architects of corruption dwell. Thessy settings drip with excess, glass staircases, infinity pools, chandeliers that sparkle like they belong to a different planet than the world of Eloise's modest home. The lighting here is sterile and clinical, as though luxury itself has scrubbed away warmth. These spaces feel hollow despite their grandeur, echoing emptiness rather than a life. Critically, they represent what a corruption builds with the blood of the vulnerable. Whenever Clay infiltrates these mansions, his shadow seems to accuse the very walls, and when violence erupts in these sterile spaces, it feels less like action and more like a storm tearing through a palace of lies. One of the more interesting cinematic choices is the use of industrial settings, warehouses, factories, parking structures. These are not glamorous spaces, but they become battlegrounds. The cinematography often drenches theme in darkness, pierced by slashes of neon or the glow of machinery, creating an atmosphere that feels both real and mythic. It is as though the film wants us to see modern industry itself as complicit or at least indifferent to exploitation. The hum of machines echoes the hum of bees. But in these spaces, hum is hollow, lacking harmony. The setting becomes a critique of industrial soullessness. Lighting is perhaps the film's most subtle but powerful cinematic element. Notice how the farmhouse is lit with natural light, soft and forgiving, while the spaces of corruption are dominated by artificial fluorescence or harsh spotlights. Darkness is never simply absent. Here it is a stage upon which truth and lies are exposed. In scenes where Clay exacts justice, the lighting often shifts to a stark contrast, chiaroscurely reminiscent, suggesting that morality itself lives in shadow, that justice is not clean but cut from darkness. To me, this visual style ties the film back to a lineage of cinematic traditions, noir, westerns, even biblical epics where light and shadow carried moral meaning. Cinematography often frames Clay alone. Even in the midst of chaos, wide shots emphasizes isolation, small against a sprawling corruption. Tight close-ups, by contrast, capture the calm intensity in his eyes, the discipline that separates him from the frantic energy of his enemies. The visual language reinforces the idea that he is both living apart from the world, a man of the hive yet outside it. I found myself thinking of Crusoe as Ronan wandering into corrupt villages or the gunslinger walking into a western town. The camera tells us here is a man who does not belong, and precisely because of that he is the only one capable of restoring a balance. Even the use of sound intersects with setting. The farmhouse he hums with bees. The city with traffic. At the call center with scripted chatter. These soundscapes are not incidental, they define each space's moral temperature. The sound design reminds USA where life is nurtured and where ice is drained. What struck me is how often a silence intrudes after violence. The film will cut to sudden quiet, leaving us alone with buzzing bees or the creak of wood. These moments felt like moral pauses, cinematic breaths, asking us to reflect on what we've just seen. The climactic settings are particularly powerful. When Clay storms the core of the operation, the film moves into spaces that are almost abstract. High-rise ice gleaming in glass. Offices that look more like temples of money than workplaces. Here, the camera often tilts upward, dwarfing Clay against structure as designed to symbolize invincibility. Yet, as he dismantles them, the settings collapse in meaning. What once seemed impenetrable is revealed as fragile. This inversion is one of the film's sharpest symbolic tricks, showing that power structures, for all their towering facades, crumble when someone refuses to bow to them. Finally, the return to the farmhouse closes a circle. The Sami setting that opened the film greets USA again, but now it is changed. Or perhaps it is we who are changed. The hum of the bees is the same, the light is the same, but we cannot see it with a Sami innocence. It is no longer Eden, but a sanctuary scarred by a loss. The setting itself feels heavier, reminding us that a piece is never absolute. It must be defended, and defending it comes at a cost. What makes the cinematic elements of The Beekeeper so compelling is their coherence. Every space, every light, every hum is part of a language. The farmhouse speaks of order. The Cala Center speaks of corruption. The mansions speak of decadence. The warehouses speak of soulless machinery, and the return to be speaks of cycles of balance that can be restored but never permanently. This is cinema working as a literature setting, not as backdrop but as symbol, as moral architecture. And for me, that is why The Beekeeper lingers. Not because of its explosions or its fist fights, though those are crafted with a skill, but because when I close my eyes, I can still see the sunlight on wooden hives, still hear the hum of bees, still feel the sterility of offices that drain lives, still sense the cold hollowness of mansions built on misery. These images live on because they're more than visuals, they are truths painted with a light and sound. Carved into memory by a film that understands the world is always shaped by the spaces we inhabit. Behind every polished action sequence lies a meshy world of sweat, improvisation, accidents, and camaraderie. The Beekeeper was no exception. If anything, the process of creating this film often mirrored its story. Order constantly battling chaos and victory achieved only through persistence. To watch the finished movie is to see something lean, sharp, and purposeful. To hear the tale as from the set is to realize how fragile that order was, how easily it could have tipped into disaster, and how many people had to study the high for to thrive. One of the earliest behind the scenes tensions arose around tone. David Ayer came in wanting grit, something raw and close to bone. A movie that felt surreal as in a watch or fury. Jason Statham, by contrast, arrived with a sense of ritual precision. He approached every scene like choreography, drilling the moves again and again until they were second nature. At first, this creative friction wanted spontaneity. Statham wanted control. Crew members recall it long evenings where director and star would argue over whether a fight should look sloppy and brutal or clean and surgical. But in those debates, a strange chemistry was born. The fights in the finished film feel both real and mythic, messy yet exact, Because Thea, the child of two competing visions, what might have been a clash became the film's unique DNA. Then came the best of themselves. The production had insisted on bringing real bees onto set, partly for authenticity, partly because wanted that hum to be genuine. They hired professional appliers to handle the hives. But bees are not actors. They knew how to follow scripts. On warm days, Thea behaved peacefully. On colder or stormier days, they grew agitated more than once. Filming had to stop when entire swarms became restless, flooding the lights and lenses. Statham himself was stung on multiple occasions, though he reportedly refused to flinch. "You respect them, they respect you," he told a crew member, though his red, swollen hand told a different story. Some joked that the bees were the strictest union on set. If conditions weren't right, a production simply couldn't go forward. Sound design carried its own amusing complications. The audio crew had hours of footage ruined because the bees' humor bled into microphones at unpredictably volumes. At first, this was seen as a disaster, but then, in post-production, the team decided to embrace it. They wove those hums into the soundtrack, slowed it down and layered into ominous drones beneath the score. In other words, accidents became art. And that's the story of so much filmmaking. What begins as an obstacle transforms into a gift if you're open to it. The call center saga sparked one of the strangest behind-the-scenes episodes, designed to mimic a real scam operation. It was so convincing that at one point, local authorities thought it was real. An anonymous tip had been made about a suspicious activity in the building. Police visited only to find actors pretending to scam fictional victims. The crew laughed it off later, but for a brief moment, fiction nearly became indistinguishable from reality. Into the theory that a movie about scams almost became mistaken for one, the stunts brought their own behind-the-scenes legends. Jason Statham is famous for doing most of his own work, but this film pushed even him. In one scene involving fire, he insisted on going without a double. The flames spread unpredictably and are nearly call cut, but still barreled through, improvising his escape. That take made it into the final film. Watching it, you'd never know you were seeing a genuine moment of panic turn into performance. Later, stunt coordinators admitted their hair went grey that day. Editing was not through crucible. The first assembly of the movie ran over 3 hours. It included a long subplot about Clay's deeper past in the Beekeeper program. Training sequences missions hinted at in shadow. In test screenings, however, audiences felt the digressions pulled too much of focus away from the central revenge story. Reluctantly, Ayer trimmed it down, leaving hints instead of full exposition. Somewhere locked away in an editing suite, lies a longer, stranger version of Beekeeper, one that dives further into mythology of the Secret Order. Fans may never see it, but the ghost lingers. But perhaps the richest behind-the-scenes insights are not about accidents or cuts, but about human rituals. David Ayer, known for his intensity, began each day on set by gathering the crew and reading a line of poetry. Sometimes it was Blake, sometimes Milton, sometimes something had scrawled in a notebook. His reasoning were not making noise, were making myth. At first, some rolled their eyes, but as days stretched into weeks, the ritual became grounding. People remembered those lines long after the shoot. They whispered them during setups, recited them over lunch. In the end, those small moments of reflection gave the film a heartbeat. There's also the story of camaraderie that only happens when people suffer together. Night shoots in cold rain, equipment failures, the long hours in abandoned warehouses. All of it forged bonds. Crew members joked about becoming a high via themselves, each with a role, each enduring the sting for the sake of the honey. It's fitting, isn't it, that a film about beekeepers turn its own crew into one. And then there are the things that we'll never see on screen, but which shaped the movie spirit. A storm that halted shooting, leaving Statham standing alone under rain, watching a lightning with bees still humming in their hives nearby, a prop computer accidentally connecting to real internet traffic, nearly mimicking a scam, a costume designer sneaking bee motifs in Clay's clothing, hexagon stitching honey linings, so subtle you'd miss theme unless you looked. Taken together, these insights revealed that the making of the Beekeeper was never smooth, never neat. It was a constant struggle between chaos and order. Bees swarming, actors arguing, storms interrupting, accidents birthing beauty, which is exactly what the film itself is about. Perhaps that's why it feels so authentic, because the making of it was not pretend. It was live chaos sculpted into order drawn from stings and sweat. What makes the Beekeeper rise above the level of just another revenge thriller is not the choreography of its fights or precision of its pacing, but the symbols that hum beneath it all. This is a film drenched in metaphor, so much so that it sometimes feels less like an action movie and more like a parable wearing the costume of an action movie. The bees, the hive, the cycle of order and chaos. All of these carry a weight far greater than spectacle. To explore theme is to find the marrow of the story. The truth that lingers long after the explosions fade. The most obvious theme and yet the one richest in layers is the hive itself. The hive represents a society, fragile, interdependent, requiring balance and protection. Best to thrive only in harmony, and when threatened, they rally to defend their community. The tragedy of Eloise is noted just that she is one woman destroyed by a scam. It is that the hive failed her. She was left exposed alone and the predators feasted without consequence. The Beekeeper then becomes less a manga than a metaphor. The guardian who steps in when a hive's defenses collapse. Critically, this is not just about him avenging a neighbor. It is about restoring balance to a community fractured by corruption. Violence in this framework takes on symbolic meaning. Clay does not wield violence like an ordinary action hero with a swagger or bravado. His violence is surgical, ritualistic, almost monastic. He prunes diseased branches to save the tree. He eradicates parasites so that the hive may live. In mythology, violence often carries his duality, destructive on the surface, restrictive in essence. Clay embodies this paradox. He is both destroyer and protector, both shadow and light. In him, violence becomes a metaphor for purification, a cleansing fire that makes way for a renewal. Another powerful theme is corruption disguised as order. The scam call centers mimic the structure of a hive, buzzing workers, each with their task, but inverted. Instead of sustaining life, they drain it. The mansions of the powerful mimic stability, order, success, but they are hollow. Parasitic, the Congresswoman cloaks exploitation in the language of a public duty. This inversion of symbols is critical. The film is not only about a good versus evil, but about false hives versus true hives. Some structures for attendee communities pretend to serve, but in truth they exploit. The Beekeeper's role is not just to fight enemies, but to expose the false hives. To burn theme down so that something authentic might survive. One of the subtler themes that struck me is a tension between solitude and responsibility. Clay begins in a solitude, tending bees withdrawn from the world. He longs for peace, for quiet repetition. But peace proves impossible when the hive around him collapses. His arc suggests that solitude is not enough. Responsibility to the hive is unavoidable. In literature, this theme recurs often. The hero who wants only to be left alone is summoned to act by the suffering of others. Clay represents a paradox to human life. We long for solitude, but we cannot escape irresponsibility. The hum of the hive is always calling us back. The theme of justice versus vengeance also hums through the narrative. On the surface, Clay is avenging Eloise. Uta step deeper, and you realize his mission is less about personal revenge and more about systemic justice. He is not angry only for her, but for everyone like her, every vulnerable soul preyed upon by systems of exploitation. The distinction matters. Vengeance is selfish, a close-knit circle. Justice, even when violent, opens outward, aiming to restore balance with community. The film never explicitly answers whether Clay is avenger or guardian. Instead, it leaves us to wrestle with the ambiguity, which makes the story resonate all the more. The bees themselves, of course, are the most enduring symbol. They are more than a metaphor. They are chorus. Their humor permeates the soundscape, a constant reminder of balance, of fragility, of interdependence. They represent not just the world Clay protects, but the philosophy he embodies: patience, discipline, sacrifice of the hive. To me, the bees are like the chorus in a Greek tragedy. They do not speak directly, but they remind us of the stakes of the moral weight of what is unfolding. Their presence elevates the film into something mythic. Even the title itself is symbolic. The Beekeeper is not merely a man tending insects. It is a title, a mantle, an identity passed down through secret order. It suggests a guardianship, secrecy, discipline, but it also suggests fragility. A beekeeper is powerful not because he dominates, but because he protects. His job is not a conquest, but stewardship. In this way, the film redefines heroism. The true hero is not the conqueror, but the protector, the one who ensures the hive survives. Symbolism also threads through the settings. The farmhouse represents Eden, order, innocence. The call center represents false hives, perversions of order. The mansions represent corruption built on decay. The warehouses represent a soulless machinery. Each space is more than a backdrop. It is a moral architecture, a symbol in stone and steel. The return of the farmhouse sod at the end is symbolic too. A cycle closed, order temporarily restored, but the scar remains. Eloise is gone, the hive survives, but it has lost members. These echoes eternal theme. Justice does not erase loss, it only balances it. Another theme that resonated with me is that of silence and speech. Clay is a man of few words and his silence is heavy with a meaning. He embodies action over talk, conviction over rhetoric. The villains by contrast drown in words. Scammers are reciting scripts, politicians spouting at empty promises, corruption cloaked in eloquence. The film critiques a world where words are often tools of exploitation and reminds us that truth is found not in speech but in action. Silence in this story becomes more powerful than rhetoric. There is also the theme of inevitability. From the moment Eloise falls, Clay's path feels the preordained. He does not want to return to violence, but he must. He does not want to confront corruption, but he cannot ignore it. This inevitability echoes mythic patterns. The reluctant hero who cannot escape his fate. The avenger called to balance the scales. Ida suggests that in every hive there comes a time when someone must answer the call, no matter the reluctance. It is a less choice than destiny. For me, perhaps the most haunting theme is the fragility of the hive itself. Society, like a beehive, is always vulnerable. Ida can be protected, balanced, sustained, but it is never invincible. Corruption, like disease, always lurks, always waits for weakness. The beekeeper's role then is never finished, even after balance is restored. Vigilance must continue. This theme resonates far beyond the film. Ida speaks to our own lives, our own communities. Who are our beekeepers? What stands guard when the hive is under attack? And what happens when no one answers? In the end, the beekeeper is not really about one man fighting a corruption. It is about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between true hives and false ones, between solitude and responsibility. Aate symbols I'm in the background asking you not just to watch but to reflect, and that is why for me the film feels less like entertainment and more like an allegory. It buzzes with questions that outlive the credits, questions that linger like the hum of bees in our ears long after the theater goes dark. What makes The Beekeeper so fascinating to me is that it's not just a story or a performances that linger, it's the why the film was built, brick by brick, a frame by frame through choices of graft. The techniques here are as much a language as a dialogue, shaping what we feel, even when we don't consciously notice, watching it carefully. I began to see how every shot, every edit, every sound cue was placed like a work of fabbing in a hive, small on its own, but essential to the whole, and then beyond the craft. There's a strange tale how the film buzzed its way through the box office, defying expectations. Let's begin with the camera. David Ayer's style has always leaned toward the tactile, the grounded, the sense that we are in the dirt with the characters. In The Beekeeper, he brought that realism into a genre that usually thrives in stylization. The camera often hugs closely to Clay's movements, following his fists, his steps, his breathing, so that action feels not like spectacle, but like survival. At other times, it pulls back into wide frames, emphasizing his isolation, a lone figure against a sprawling corruption. The shift between intimacy and distance becomes a kind of Farron, close when we need to feel his precision, distant when we need to remember how small he is against the system. I thought of Kurosawa's samurai films in this, the way a man alone can fill a frame yet still look dwarfed by the world around him. Editing too plays a crucial role. Fred Raskin's cuts area sharp but not frantic. Modern action films often drown in hyperactive editing, never allowing a shot to breathe. Here, however, fights are cued to preserve clarity. You always know where Clay is, what he's doing, why it matters. This creates a sense of control, mirroring Clay's own discipline. Yet, there are moments when the edit deliberately fractures, cutting it quicker, jarring us to mimic the chaos of the world he is tearing apart. It's a dance between order and disorder, editing as metaphor. I found myself thinking of literature again. How some writers use long sentences to soothe and short ones to shock. The film edits like a novelist punctuating a page. Sound design may be the film's most ingenious technical layer. As I mentioned before, the hum of bees is woven into the score, stretched, deepened, layered until it becomes atmosphere. Sometimes it's subtle. You feel a low vibration but you don't consciously register it. Sometimes it swells, rising almost like a choir accompanying Clay's movements. The effect is haunting. Nature itself becomes part of the soundtrack of Justice. Beyond bees, the soundscape emphasizes contrasts, the sterile chatter scammers, the hollow echo of empty mansions, the metallic groan of warehouses. Each space has its own sound signature, its own moral temperature. The sound tells you whether you are in a space of life or a space of corruption. The score by David Ayer fuses electronic and orchestral elements. Strings swell not in triumph but in tension. Percussion strikes not in a but in jagged bursts. The electronic hum borrowed from bass grounds the whole thing in unease. What you loved is that the music never tries to be heroic. It is not the soundtrack of a conquering warrior but a reluctant guardian, a man who takes no joy in what he must do. It reminded me of minimalist composers like Johan Johansson, scores that take rather than celebrate, light into works of silent storytelling. Natural light fills a farmhouse, soft and golden, making it feel sacred. Artificial fluorescence dominates the call centers, making them look lifeless, almost sickly. Neon and a harsh contrast paint the industrial spaces, echoing corruption's coldness. In climactic battles, shadows dominate, chiaroscuro framing Clay as a man who lives between light and darkness. The lighting is moral language, warm where there is life, cold where there's superheatation, shadowed where there is ambiguity. It is visual philosophy whispered through light. The choreography of fights deserves its own reflection. Statham's style has always been efficient, but here it is pared down even further. Each move is about ending conflict quickly, no flourish, no indulgence. It's not entertainment choreography, it's survival choreography. Watching him dismantle the opponents, I realize the fights themselves are metaphors. They are not about showing off power, but about excising infection. Every broken arm, every collapsed guard, every toppled figure is less victory than a purification. Even violence becomes a technique, a philosophy expressed through motion. And then, of course, comes a question of the box office. Mania assumed The Beekeeper would be an author mid-tier January release, forgotten within weeks. Instead, it became one of the biggest surprises of 2024. With a budget of around $40 million, it clawed its way past $150 million worldwide. An astonishing return for a film critics dismissed as pulpy revenge fare. Audiences responded. They didn't just come for Statham's fists, they came for the metaphor. Even if they couldn't name it, word of mouth spread. People said it's not just action, it's deeper. Some joke that it was John Wick with bees, but beneath the jokes was genuine respect. Why did it succeed? I think because in a world where people feel constantly exploited by systems, scams, corporations, politics, the fantasy of a lone guardian resonated. The high-V imagery spoke unconsciously audiences. Everyone knows what it feels like to be part of a hive under threat. Everyone longs for a beekeeper. The box office then becomes less about numbers and more about resonance. The film became a cultural hum, buzzing louder than the budget should have allowed. Critically, it was divisive. Some dismissed it as a cliché, others praised its allegorical richness, but the box office proved it as something critics often forget. Audiences respond not just a novelty, but to myth. This story, cloaked in best instincts, tapped into something eternal, the longing for justice, the fear of corruption, the fragility of a community. That is why people bought tickets. That is why it kept buzzing along after its release weekend. For me, the most striking thing about the techniques and the commercial story of The Beekeeper is how they mirror each other. The film's craft is all about a balance between clarity and chaos, silence and sound, light and shadow. The box office journey is the same, a balance between critics' dismissal and audience embrace, between small budget and big returns. In both cases, the high-V survived, order was restored, and the hum of bees, cinematic, symbolic, cultural, carried on. When I think about The Beekeeper, I don't just remember the story or the symbols, but the people who embodied them. Jason Statham, of course, stand at the center, but he isn't alone. Around them are actors who gave shape to a corruption, a conscience, to a vulnerability. And beyond them are the voices of audiences, critics, interviewers. The hive outside the hive, buzzing with their own reactions. Statham's performance as Adam may be one of his most stripped down. Gone are the smirks, the one-liners, the stylish flourishes that made him famous in earlier action films. Here he is pared back to silence, precision, stillness. In interviews, he admitted that this role felt more personal than many others. He described Clay as a man of ritual, someone who lived by a discipline but is forced to use it for a destruction. He also spoke about spending time with real beekeepers before filming, learning how to move with patience, how to respect the hive. It fascinated me that an actor known for explosive movement would train in a stillness to hold himself like a man who has lived among bees. That stillness bleeds through the screen, and it is why Clay never feels like an action a caricature but like a real man carrying unbearable weight. Opposite him, Jeremy Irons, always a master presence, takes not the role of Wallace Westwish, a political manipulator whose calm voice hides rot. Irons admitted in press junkets that he enjoyed playing some India whose poison is spoken in whispers, no to shouts. Watching him, I was struck by how his calmness made him more terrifying than any shouting villain could. His voice, smooth and deliberate, carried the weight of institutions. Also, though corruption itself had gone to a finishing school. Josh Hutcherson, cast as Derek Danforth, the entitled son, surprised many. Known to audiences for roles in Hunger Games and lighter projects, here he leaned into arrogancy and recklessness. Interviews revealed that he relished a chance to be hated. He called Derek the kind of person you would recognize instantly from real life. A person who's never been told number. It's the true. His performance feels less like kiya acting and more like channeling the ugliness of privilege. Audiences seem to agree. Social media buzz with comments alike. I've never wanted to see a villain punch more in my life. Aate, sometimes being loathed is the highest form of success for an actor. Emmy Raver-Lampman, playing FBI agent Verona Parker, gave the film its conscience. In interviews, she spoke about wanting a Verona to represent the audience's moral struggle. Someone torn between enforcing the law and recognizing when the law fails justice. Her performance anchors the film's gray areas. She doesn't steal scenes with flash, but she lingers because she embodies a question we're left with: what do you do when right and illegal no longer line? Critics highlighted her as a standout, praising the way she played Verona. Not as an action foil, but as a human being struggling in real time. Phylicia Rashad's presence as Eloise gave the story its heart. Though her screen time is short, her warmth permeates the film. Rashad spoke tenderly in interviews about how she saw Eloise as a solo feather hive, a symbol of all those who trust and are betrayed. She said that when she read the script, she wept because she knew women like Eloise in real life. People who have been destroyed by systems they didn't understand. That authenticity shows here. Absence drive the entire film. And here a performance makes us feel that absence as more than a plot device. Even beyond the main cast, smaller roles carry the weight. Actors portraying call center scammers, for example, where Coach maintained a robotic cheerfulness, a performance that critics noted was unnervingly authentic. One actor confessed that after a week of rehearsing scam scripts, he started dreaming in them. Waking up with phrases like, "We're here to help you secure your account." That eerie detail seeps into the performances, making them feel less like characters and more like symptoms of disease. The cast often spoke about the atmosphere on set as intense but strangely communal. Statham kept mostly to himself, often silent between takes, but he was fiercely protective of his co-stars, insisting that they feel safe during physical scenes. Hutcherson admitted he felt genuinely intimidated filming confrontations with Statham. Not because Statham was so hostile, but because his presence was so commanding. Irons, ever a seasoned veteran, reportedly lightened tension by quoting Shakespeare between takes, reminding everyone that even revenge thrillers have roots in ancient tragedy. When the film reached audiences, the hive outside the theater came alive. Reactions were divided but passionate. Some viewers hailed it as Statham's best work in years, praising its allegorical depth. Others dismissed it as an author revenge thriller, unable or unwilling to look past the action surface. What struck me though was how often ordinary viewers, not critics, latched onto the symbolism. Social media buzzed appropriately with memes about Buzz Lightyear with shotgun and a honey-coated justice. But beneath the jokes, people were engaging with the metaphor. One audience member wrote, "Ida made me think about my grandma getting scammed. I wish someone like that existed." That I think is a true measure of impact when a story sparks personal connections. Box office reviews carry to their own narrative. Trade publications were stunned at how strongly the film performed for a January release, a month often considered a dumping ground. Analysts admitted they underestimated audience hunger for myth disguised as pulp. Interviews with viewers revealed that many went in expecting generic action and came out surprised at how symbolic it felt. That gap between expectation and delivery fueled word of mouth. What fascinated me most was how international audiences responded in countries like Brazil and India, where scams and corruption are often part of everyday life. The film resonated deeply. Critics there spoke about how Clay felt like a folk hero not because of his fist but because of his guardianship. In the UK, audiences picked up on the rural authenticity of the beekeeping imagery. In the US, viewers latched onto its political critique. Each region seemed to read the symbol as to its own hive, its own vulnerabilities. That to me proves the universality of the themes. So when you think of the cast and the voices around them, I don't just see actors delivering lines, I see Statham meditating with the bees. I see Rashad carrying the soul of the film in her warmth. I see Hutcherson leaning into ugliness. Ayer's whispering a poison with elegance, Lampman giving our conscience, and I hear audiences buzzing, critics clashing, viewers carrying the hive home with them. In the end, the cast brought the hive to life and the audience became part of it. The film was never just watched. It was inhabited, argued over, memed, loved, dismissed, but always felt. There comes a moment after film is unspooled images and its sound is faded, when we are left in silence. It is in that silence that we discover whether the story lingers, whether it has touched something deeper than the eyes, whether it has entered the bloodstream of thought. The Beekeeper ends not with spectacle, not with speeches, but with quiet, humbees, the calm return to ritual, the reminder that balance once disrupted can never truly be restored without cost. And as I sat with it, letting the silence sink in, I realized this was never a film about violence at all. It was a film about guardianship, about a responsibility, about the fragile beauty of the hive we all share. What strikes me looking back across everything we explored together is how the film manages to live on two levels at once. On the surface, it is lean and muscular, an action thriller that delivers the promise of chases, fights, and vengeance. But beneath that surface, it is something much older, almost mythic. The Beekeeper is not just Adam Clay, a retired operative turned reluctant avenger. He is an archetype, the silent guardian who emerges when a hive is threatened. The reluctant hero who carries the burden no one else dares to lift. Stories like us have existed for millennia, and perhaps that is why These One resonates. It reminds us that thought with technology changes. Those scams now come through glowing screens instead of swords. The need for guardianship never disappears. The themes hum together like wings and rhythm. The hive of society, fragile and interdependent. The bees are a chorus reminding us of balance and a sacrifice. Violence is paradox. A destructive yet restorative. Corruption as false order. We're in the mass of legitimacy while draining life. Solitude clashing with responsibility. Vengeance colliding with justice. All of these are not just cinematic devices, but human truth. We see them in our headlines, in our neighborhoods, in the faces of those who are exploited and those who profit. That is why this film works so well. Beneath all the adrenaline and action, it asks questions that we live with every day. What makes the conclusion so poignant is that it never pretends to offer definitive answers. Eloise does not return. Corruption is not erased from the world. Clay remains alone, returning to his best not with innocence, but carrying the scars of what he has endured. Justice is never clean. and it is never permanent. It has to be pursued again and again by those willing to step forward and defend what is right. The hum we hear at the end is not a source of comfort, it is a reminder. The work is never truly finished. And that is what makes the story feel honest. Too many films wrap themselves in triumph, as though a single victory can somehow redeem everything that came before it. The Beekeeper refuses to tell that comforting lie. It acknowledges that life is more fragile, complicated, and uncertain. In that honesty, the film becomes even more powerful. The same balance can be seen in the filmmaking itself. The camera shifts between intimacy and distance, reminding us that clay is both an individual and an archetype. The editing moves between clarity and chaos, echoing the struggle between order and disorder. The sound design blends the natural hum of bees with the musical score, turning what might have been an accident into atmosphere. Even the lighting seems to give morality a visual language, warm when there is life, cold when there is predation, and shadowed when there is ambiguity. None of this is craftsmanship for its own sake. Every technique serves a larger idea. The filmmaking itself becomes a philosophy. That is why even the smallest details resonate. Behind the scenes, the production often seemed to mirror the story it was telling. Real bees disrupted cameras. Actors were stung and reminded to approach the creatures with humility. Sets were convincing enough to be mistaken for real scam operations. Poetry was read at dawn. Fire scenes threatened to spiral beyond control. It was chaos being transformed into order. Accidents becoming art. A hive of human beings working and struggling towards something larger than themselves. Perhaps that is why the film feels so authentic. It was not born from perfect smoothness, but from struggle. In a strange way, the production itself became a hive trying to survive its own storms. And then there is the audience, the hive beyond the hive. Critics were divided. Some dismissed the film, while others found much to praise. Yet ordinary viewers connected with it in ways that critics could not always predict. People saw their grandparents in Eloise, their anger in Clay, and their frustration with corruption in Derek and his mother. They carried the story into memes, conversations, debates, and personal reflections. In Brazil, India, the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere, audiences found something of themselves within this hive. That kind of universality is one of the defining qualities of a true fable. The film may wear the mask of an action thriller, but underneath the genre is something deeply familiar and shared. So where does that leave us as we come to the end of this long reflection? For me, it leaves us with questions. Who are our beekeepers? Who stands guard over our hives, our families, our communities, and the fragile societies we have built? What happens when no one answers the call? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if the moment ever comes, are we willing to become beekeepers ourselves? Are we willing to sacrifice solitude for responsibility, silence for action, and comfort for guardianship? These are not questions the film can answer. But then again, perhaps no story truly can. Stories do not always provide answers. They stir something within us, they unsettle us, they leave us buzzing with thoughts and restless with possibilities. In the end, The Beekeeper is not simply about a man seeking revenge for a neighbor. It is about the eternal struggle between exploitation and guardianship, between false hives and true ones, between predators who drain what others have built and protectors who are willing to defend it. It reminds us that justice is fragile, that peace can be temporary, but that dignity is always worth defending. The film leaves us with a simple but powerful reminder. A hive survives only when someone is willing to stand against the chaos threatening Ida again and again. And so, as I close this journey with you, my dear companions in cinema and literature, I find myself grateful for stories like this, not simply because they entertain us, although they certainly do, but because they remind us of truths we so easily forget. Life is fragile, community is everything, corruption is always waiting somewhere at the edges, and somewhere, somehow, there must always be a beekeeper. If you have come this far with me, thank you. Thank you for stepping into the hive, for listening to the hum beneath the action, and for searching for meaning where others may see only fists and explosions. If you found something meaningful here, if you felt the sting of truth alongside me, I invite you to stay with Cinema Vault, subscribe, and let us continue exploring these stories, myths, and metaphors together, because the hive is not only on the screen, it exists here too, in this community of seekers, viewers, and thinkers buzzing together, and like every hive, it survives only when we are willing to protect it.